Hey DZone, we're here at the closing of All Things Open. I'm here with Jono Bacon. That's how you pronounce the Jono, right?
That's right.
And Bacon, I think I got right.
That's definitely right.
Yes. And Master of Community Management, especially technical, but not just technical communities. Lots of big picture stuff around the kinds of things we've been talking about here at All Things Open, and around open source communities in general, but also internal communities. Anybody where a lot of people are working collaboratively in a way that ensures that the product is most valuable for the largest number of people.
Yeah.
So can you actually just tell us a little bit about your background, how you got here, what you're doing right now?
Yeah. So I got interested in open source back in 1998, and it switched a light bulb on for me. It was this notion of, it was less about the software, it was this notion of people collaborating electronically that I found really interesting. And then I used to be a journalist years ago because I was trying to earn some extra money when I was at university. Ended up writing for some Linux magazines, and then I moved on. I got hired to go and work at a place called Open Advantage, which was basically a government-funded organization to provide consultancy for companies local to where I used to live in England, because a lot of the business was moving out to China and people were out of work, so open source was a good solution there. But that was funded for a limited period of time, as all government-funded projects are, and so I then went to Canonical to basically lead the community development there for Ubuntu, and I spent just under 8 years there. And it was there that I wrote the book, and I started the community leadership summit, because I'm just really passionate about furthering the art and science of how we build effective collaboration. And then I went to work at a place called XPRIZE, which is a foundation that basically has huge competitions for solving major challenges in the world. Like there's a $50 million global learning XPRIZE for teaching kids how to read with an application on a tablet, for example, and things like that. And I just thought, community and collaboration fits very well into that sphere. But then, as of about a week ago, I've just announced that I'm going to be joining GitHub next month as Director of Community there. So,
oh, awesome.
Yeah, so I'm really excited to get started.
Awesome open source community. That actually raises, for me, the question, 15, 16 years ago, what kinds of tools and communities have they related to those tools versus today, where we have places like GitHub and Bitbucket and so forth?
Yeah, it's weird because back in the early days of Linux, I think Linux was the standout project that really showed how a lot of this worked. And Linus has said himself, I don't know what I'm doing, I'm just figuring it out as I go along. And back then, for example, with the Linux kernel, there was no version control really used. People just emailed patches to the mailing list. It was just, the key thing was getting people together to discuss ideas and to work together on pieces. And I think what's happened is the basic premise of a bunch of people who are passionate about something, being able to somehow exchange things, exchange content to further a common goal, has basically, we've just evolved all these pieces. So, we had CVS and then Subversion, and now we have Git, and there's issue tracking and bug tracking, and we've got things like Trello and Waffle for planning out projects. And the tooling has evolved, but I think what we're really starting to see now as well is just the evolution of the methodology. And one of the things that's been important to me is to contribute towards that, like writing the book and doing the conference was one contribution, but to also really emphasize that there isn't one way to do this. There are lots of different ways to build strong and effective communities. And one of the things I love about coming to events like All Things Open is every single time I learn something new. I'll learn like a nugget of information. There'll always be like,
for example, like at this time, like what's a nugget that you learned this time? I learned a bunch.
So I'll give you an example. I find like there's lots of individual things that I'll learn, but then there'll be like one or two really standout statements that really get my brain thinking. So, for example, one of the comments that one of my new colleagues at GitHub, Brandon Keeper, said was, source code is an artifact of collaboration. If you think about it, we often focus on the source code, and that's really important. It's the center of the value in the way people perceive it. But really, the value is the community. In the same way that I think when I've worked with companies to open source their technology, they're all focused on the code, and it's like the focus really isn't about the code, it's about the community. Right,
so the injection of intelligence is actually from the people anyway.
Right.
Because Doug Engelbart has this book, Augmenting Human Intellect.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's about basically like, look, the problems that we have now are bigger than any individual can solve. And software is not going to solve it. The whole point of software is to make it the case that minds can actually connect. Instead of us sort of like communicating through this like weirdly like fuzzy channel that has a lot to do with whatever problem solving, but interpersonal relations, some kind of communicative channel that actually lets the minds solve problems, and that's software.
And it's one of the things I learned from going to X Prize was, you know, in the open source world, we're so used to, we have so much content to collaborate around, code, translations, documentation, whatever. When I went to X Prize, I was looking at how do you build a community of people who want to work together to solve major problems in the world with exponential technology. Was there are certain bits of content there, such as code, but that's more of a mission-orientated group of people. And the two things I learned was having something that's hackable is really important, and that's why I think open source has been so successful. Is fundamentally you've got something that you have access to that you can contort and twist and evolve in different ways. But then the challenge is packaging up the workflow of that, of how you do that in a simple and effective way. Because anybody can sit down and come out with a, like, Git is a good example of this. You can create really complicated Git workflows with branches that are not very intuitive to a lot of people. But for most new developers, for example, they need something that's really simple and intuitive. So I think a lot of the nuance and the elegance is in how you package up information in that workflow effectively.
Right.
And when we get that right, it's just remarkable. Wikipedia is a good example of that. They made it really easy to contribute, and now it's worth tens of billions of dollars by the Smithsonian.
Right,
So
it's actually just an amazing, just incredible resource.
it's phenomenal, yeah.
So there's a temptation from a developer perspective to say that like, collaboration is a concurrency problem, and we should use the same like Lamport algorithms to figure out, and that's obviously not actually what happens in the community, right? So how do you, I guess the extremes to me are like an operating system with lots of threads and magically people just talking to each other in a room and suddenly synergizing to solve all problems. Like, how do those come together? Or?
I think it's one of the most complicated elements, and this is something I learned a lot when I joined Canonical with Ubuntu. Was one of the things that agitated me a little bit about open source when I first got involved was back in 1998, it was heavily anchored towards programming. So I'm a programmer. I've written quite a bit of code, not very good code.
Books are like the MySQL. And
yeah, but I used to be a PHP web developer years ago, and these days I write in Python, the language of choice. But I'm a pretty crappy developer, to be honest with you, and my natural kind of attraction is really working more around people and collaboration. And I think there's lots of people out there who are not necessarily internally motivated by code. They're motivated by localization or documentation or equality or whatever it might be. And back in 1998, it was heavily anchored towards if you didn't know C or Perl, you were basically out of luck. And I think one of the goals that I set out with Ubuntu was that everybody is welcome and everybody's got a piece that they can play. So we had marketing teams and translations and docs and all kinds of stuff. The challenge with that is that you get really quite different mindsets. So programmers are very efficient with each other by and large. Like if you go to a pretty hardcore programming conference such as Linux Plumbers, you get very, very efficient targeted discussions with a lot of value. When you add into that mix people who are not naturally thinking in that way because they're docs writers or whatever else, because there's not the crossover of commonality of interest is narrower, it's harder to have in-depth conversations. And one of the mistakes that I made was thinking you should be able to get everybody into the same room, irrespective of background and experience, and have deep and meaningful conversations. And that just doesn't happen. It was a nice idea in theory, and it was an inclusive idea in theory, but practically it didn't work very well.
So what would happen is like if it turns into a coding discussion, then it's all like context-free chats back.
Yeah, because what would happen is you get the people who aren't coders, and they wouldn't really know what's going on. And then you may turn that conversation to things such as documentation, and then the people who are coders are like, I don't really care about docs, and so you get these different groups who are basically weighing in. And I think we moved the needle with Ubuntu, where we had a lot of conversations with multiple parties in there. Like we had some really productive Ubuntu Developer Summit conversations where there'd be a programming conversation, but then there'd also be a testing conversation, and there'd be a documentation conversation.
Right.
But there was an acknowledgement that those conversations were narrower.
Right.
And then the programming conversation, you'd break out to a separate thing where you go really in depth.
So do you need, in my mind, the immediate way to solve that kind of a problem, the communication problem, is you need some people who have multiple skill sets and communication styles. Is that true, or is that not true? Are there just ways to just organize the groups and divide them up correctly so that you can have all the coders talking one way, all the documentation people talking another way, and then someone, maybe community manager,
Right.
like stitches it together.
It's difficult because I think people with cross-discipline experience are fairly few and far between. And there are people like that, and I think a great community manager or a great engineering manager will be able to help cross those different divides. It's weird because my view is it depends on the size of the community. So I think if you have a small community of 10 or 20 people or less than 100 people, you don't really need to break people out into lots of different groups because the scope is very narrow. Like one of the examples I gave in my talk earlier on was when I first moved. I live in California. When I first moved over there, it was weird. I felt completely out of my depth because I didn't know anyone. And we moved to just outside Berkeley, and I didn't know anyone. I felt like a fish out of water. And then once I started getting to know like people within the 1 square mile radius of where my house was, the lady who worked in the coffee shop, the person who worked at the gas station, various other people, it felt like home. And I think that narrower level of, because that's just how our brains tend to work. So in big communities, it's best to break people up into teams because then you don't have this issue of one person walking into a room full of 1,000 people. But the challenge there, of course, is when you have more teams, it can create more bureaucracy of translation. What was interesting with Ubuntu was that we didn't tend to have siloed teams. It was never really an issue because there was a lot of work went into people talking about the things that they were doing, and that's why I think good communication and good reporting is so important. Otherwise, you get siloed teams, and siloed teams can happen in communities.
So like, does synchronous versus asynchronous make a difference here? Which I imagine actually, so I'm thinking like developers sometimes will hang out in an IRC and kind of not pay much attention to it. This is specific use for like the Twitter, which is almost synchronous, but you kind of check it every so often. And then there are like lists, like bug track lists or developer lists, which are completely asynchronous. Those conversations seem to work differently.
Yeah.
And how do you deal with that kind of issue, the channel type, I guess?
Yeah, my view has been generally that I've been in a position, I feel very fortunate in my career that I've been in a position where I've been able to explore this in certain situations. It's not exhaustive and it's not empirical. But so for example, XPRIZE community, everyone uses a forum. Because the majority of people who are interested in the XPRIZE community are a mixture of entrepreneurs and scientists and teachers. A lot of people are not very technical. So our forum, which is powered by Discourse, is very popular. No one uses the chat channel. And we have an IRC channel and we have like a QE IRC, like a web-based interface for it, so you don't have to figure out an IRC client. No one uses it because the notion of sitting there in a chat channel is kind of weird to a lot of the people in that crowd. In Ubuntu or in open source communities, IRC is very common, but I think most people tend to default to mailing. I think the asynchronous communication is typically what people like to do. I personally believe it's a good mixture to have. You back it into a mailing list, but then you have regular meetings, and there's different types of communication. So for example, I think what's important is informational communication. So when I was at Canonical, I used to do a Q&A session every week on a Tuesday or a Wednesday, I think it was, where I basically have 10 minutes of just news and updates for the community, and then people could ask what they wanted as Q&A. And I think people they enjoy that because it was more of a show. They didn't have to get involved if they didn't want to. Right. But then again, we'd have meetings about specific features and deliverables, and for small groups, Hangouts were good. But then IRC meetings were better for larger groups. So.
Right. So that's like the Reddit Ask Me Anything stuff, which is fun just to watch.
Which is fun to, and it's a form of entertainment. And particularly for a big community, that information delivery is really important. Is the reason why I started doing the Q&A was because I played a fairly public role in Ubuntu, and my view was I want people to be in a position where no matter what they read, if they've got any question about anything, there's a time and a place where they can ask it. Right. And I hammered that over and over again. And I kept saying to people, you can ask me anything. Like it can be about Ubuntu or Linux. You can ask me about music or politics or whatever, and you don't have to get your question vetted or approved. It was real transparency.
Right. So that is a big thing. Definitely, you sometimes feel like I don't really know who to ask about this, or where, or when.
Exactly.
There's this one catch-all.
Yeah, and I can understand why some people don't do that because they feel like they don't have enough information. And there was a historical longevity of the service that I had at Canonical, because I've been there for a long time. when you've been anywhere for a long time, when people come into the company, the power dynamic is different, right? So they come to you, and it makes it easier to have more visibility on what was going on.
Right.
So I felt in a position where I could safely do that. Whereas I can understand people in some companies that don't really know what's going on, or if you're in a company like Microsoft, which is massive, it's a little less easy to go out and say, I'm going to do a Q&A about anything that we're doing. So.
Well, one thing that struck me about Jim Whitehurst, you talked about that mailing list. That there's an email list.
Memo list, yeah.
Yeah, the memo list. This is, I guess, one of the things that I've noticed just in my own experience, and sometimes when I just think about this, is for synchronous stuff, there are certain meetings that you kind of remember as amazingly, just really, really good in the moment, like something that couldn't have happened asynchronously in half an hour. You dive so deeply into this problem and actually solved it.
Yeah.
And then you sometimes feel like, well, how can I capture that, or how can I pick this up after lunch or something like that?
Yeah.
So there's a special kind of like magical being in the same room thing.
It's the age-old question. I actually wrote an article about this a couple of weeks ago for opensource.com, the value of face-to-face, because we used to do an Ubuntu Developer Summit every 6 months. Face-to-face, we'd fly 50 community members out there, we'd sponsor them, we'd fly staff out. And then Canonical decided to not do that anymore, because it was getting very expensive. It grew to like 600 to 700 people would show up at UDS, and it became a really expensive event to put on. So we tried to replicate that online. I sat down with my team and said, how can we bring the spirit of UDS into an online setting? And we came up with something that we were all very proud of, and I'm proud of to this day, which is kind of a mixture of Google Hangouts and chat channels, and it's like scheduling. It's kind of cool how it works.
So there's multiple, there's like a video, audio, and then there's also a chat, and then there's also like...
Yeah, so you can basically go to, you have a schedule of talks or schedule of sessions, and each session's got a Hangout on air with a chat channel underneath it, so people who don't feel comfortable joining the Hangout on air have got a way in which they can engage.
Okay. I feel like I've seen this actually.
Yeah. It's called summit.ubuntu.com, and it actually inspired, I think it inspired, but something that's very similar. It's called UnHangout, which is a project going on at MIT. And it was for organizing meetings, like a block of meetings, it worked quite well. But you miss so much because, sadly, as technology people, we don't like to hear this. You just got to be in the same room as some people.
Right.
And
I was on a distributed team, and we would once a week, the 3 people who were in this area would still go to a common room because we would solve problems differently. And even if we didn't talk all that much, there was still kind of like...
there are at the X Prize office, we have these telepresence robots in the office.
Oh, like the Segway with a iPad or something?
And there's this thing it's called a Beam, which is from a company called Suitable Technologies. The most understated name for a company. Suitable Technologies. And it does make a difference. When I do most meetings conference call, but for like really important meetings, I will beam in. Because if you're in a conference call, people forget that you're on the line. And they don't speak up, and it's sometimes difficult to understand what's going on. When you're on a Beam, you're there. You're kind of almost life-size. You're a bit squarer. But it does make a difference.
So it really makes a difference. Wow.
But it doesn't in any way replace the way this works. Like sitting down with you, we could do this on the phone, but it's way more interesting and engaging when you're sat next to somebody.
Yeah, and you go in directions that you wouldn't otherwise, because there's a little bit more like request response going on when you've got like a low bandwidth channel.
Yeah.
Whereas when it's high bandwidth, is lots of multiplexing or something.
Right.
Like that, right?
Exactly. So
it's like for an open source community, for technical community developers, what value or what is your experience with kind of like real-time coding sessions or like pair programming or that kind of having people physically collaborate in the same code base at the same time?
So I have to say, in my experience, never really experimented with pair programming. The closest I would say get into that is sprints and hackathons. So getting people in the same room for a sprint, I think, is really good. And we did sprints at Canonical, but they weren't really agile sprints. It wasn't like you had the feature backlog and you had the cards and you moved them, along the wall. But it was getting people together to work collaboratively on problems, and it was really invigorating for our developers. And for my team, it was really invigorating to get together and do something similar on the community leadership team.
How big was that?
The sprints were usually sort of 50 people.
50 people in the same room, or?
What we'd do is we'd have kind of plenary sessions and then break people out into their own rooms based by team.
On the feature team?
Well, it was usually broken down. So like you had Ubuntu engineering, and then that was broken down into a set of teams like desktop, kernel, community, and then what would happen is we'd have a plenary, which was a mixture of demos and talks and whatever else in the morning, and then we'd all break out into separate rooms. So my room, my team, the community team, we'd have our own room and we'd have meetings, but then invariably people would dot in around and have individual specific meetings.
Okay.
And the sprints worked out really great. And of course, with that number of people, it was great for building relationships. You know, we'd all go out for dinner and we'd have individual team dinners, but then, you know, we'd go out and have a couple of drinks in the evening, and it was just a nice way to kind of engage and get to know each other as well. And then the other thing, of course, is hackathons, which are, you know, incentive-based competitions, which we do a lot of at XPRIZE, obviously, but incentive-based competitions around small, manageable goals, which I've only been to really a couple of hackathons, but they work so well. And the best one I ever went to was this one in Vegas that AT&T do for their developer community, and it was just unbelievable. There was like 300 people there, something like that.
Yeah.
It was, and they basically hired out a Las Vegas nightclub,
right,
and they did it in there. It was weird being in a Vegas nightclub with the lights on, surrounded by nerds.
Right, coding, yeah.
I don't think it's like that on a usual Saturday night.
I assume not, yeah. Never been to Vegas, though.
Right.
I guess one quick final question, though, is
yeah.
like, so you've been on major open source projects, but also you've like consulting work within organizations and before.
Yeah.
Do the same collaborative patterns emerge in both contexts, or is there a real difference between inside an organization and open in the community, or it depends on the organization, or just?
That's a great question. I think a lot of it's pretty similar.
People are just people on.
Yeah. One of the things that's been a really illuminating life lesson for me was going to XPRIZE, because I'd spent my entire career working in open source, and XPRIZE was an organization, or continues to be an organization that is invested in open source as a component in prizes, but it's not defined by the XPRIZE methodology. Like most of the XPRIZes are not open source prizes because they're hardware related or they don't make sense in an open source setting. And so I went from surrounding myself with people like us to surrounding myself with people who work in a whole different world that are more focused on, you know, the development of competitions and how they're marketed, and you know, relationships with sponsors and stuff like that. And even though I went into XPRIZE knowing this change was going to happen, and knowing that there was not going to be an assumption of community, like, you know, I worked in open source companies that just inherently knew how it worked. I knew that this was going to be pretty alien to a lot of people at XPRIZE, but even knowing that, I made too many assumptions. And one of the things I've learned from my tenure at XPRIZE is there is without sounding cheesy, there is a spirit and a kindness and a creativity in open source people. And I think engineers in general, but particularly in people invested in open source and people who are interested in open source, that's really unique. And you know, I was kind of developing this observation towards the end of deciding to move on. Because what would happen is I'd come to conference, I'd go to OSCON, or I'd go to LinuxCon, or here to All Things Open, and I'm just with my people. And my people it doesn't matter what color you are or what gender you are, like, we all share that spirit, and it's remarkable. And the time when it really kind of drilled home was a conversation I had with Jim Whitehurst, who's the CEO of Red Hat. And I did an interview with him for opensource.com. And he said from being at Delta, going into Red Hat, it was the inverse for him. He went from not being an open source guy to being an open source guy. And I went from being an open source guy to stepping out of it for a bit. And he said if it wasn't for him, for his experience working with Delta and previously as a management consultant, he wouldn't appreciate the nuance of the open source spirit. So from my experience of working with companies like Sony Mobile and Samsung and Deutsche Bank and places like that, that spirit is alive and kicking. It's just internal.
Right.
And it's teasing out of people, and it's people being allowed, it's giving people the permission and the safety to be an open source person within that company. And that's the major thing that people would be asking me to do, was to be an external person who would make it clear to give them permission. And as a consultant, it's good because I've got the ability to go into somewhere and tell them that what they're doing is wrong, and not fear for my job. Just fear for losing a job, potentially. And because I did it on the side, I was never really fearful of that. So I'd go into some companies and say to management, if you really want people to have that collaborative spirit, you need to allow them to do that.
Right.
You can't say to them, we want you to be more collaborative, and then not give them the bandwidth to do that.
Right.
But that spirit, I think, is prevalent, and it's one of the things that I just love about open source is that it's that kindness, it's that creativity, and it's that kindred spirit that I think keeps it all going.
Right. We're all like on the same team solving the same problem. It doesn't really matter nothing matters except that we're solving the same problem.
Right.
And therefore we're together in
Yeah.
that respect. Any final messages to send about anything for our readers to check out further, or just a takeaway, or
Go to DZone. You know?
Yes.
Yeah, go to DZone.
All free stuff.
Yeah, no, I mean, not really. I thank you for asking me to come and talk to you. And the one thing I would say is this is my first time at All Things Open, and this is a really cool event. You know, they've done a really nice job, great content, very comfortable environment, very welcoming environment. And so if you want to go to a great conference out on the east side of the United States, get out here to All Things Open.
All right, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Yep.
Appreciate it.